Okay. Literally yesterday, we had to do that emergency video where Odell Beckham Jr. signs with the Los Angeles Rams. I came out, I said to sell Odell Beckham Jr. I said to package him together with another wide receiver 3 to try to get that upgrade for your flex spot. And now, Robert Woods out for the season. We have a lot to talk about here. We have a lot that is changing. And real quick, I'm very sorry if I sound disgusting. Very sorry if this is going to be a very bad video, but I'm extremely sick. So please excuse me for that. Let me set up this live stream just 1 second before we talk about the actual impacts that we have. And of course, if you are not subscribed to the channel, go down there, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell next to the subscribe button. That way you can come out and you can come out to these live streams the second that we go live. And okay, first thing, let's look at the volume that you've had with Robert. Actually, first thing, drop that like, leave a comment letting me know your reaction on this injury as well, and drop a like on the live stream. Of course, drop that like. Now let's go through, let's look at the volume that Odell Beckham Jr. should be getting in Los Angeles now because, I mean, Robert Woods is leaving a lot behind here. Robert Woods was a wide receiver we loved coming into this season. I mean, Robert Woods was a player that I was coming out and drafting aggressively in the 4th round. I thought he was one of the highest floor wide receivers that you were going to find in fantasy because we were projecting him to be, yes, I hate to admit this, I had Robert Woods ranked higher than Cooper Kupp coming into the season. It's embarrassing to say. Nonetheless, we were expecting that this offense was going to be drastically improved with Matthew Stafford coming in, that this was going to be a top 3 passing offense in the NFL. And yeah, I mean, it kind of has been with Matthew Stafford so far this season. However, Robert Woods was that low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. This is a wide receiver that, I mean, the volume's been there. He's had 69 targets so far this season through 9 weeks. So, I mean, if you're doing some simple math here, I mean, that's about, what, 7 targets a game, 7.5 targets a game for Robert Woods. And that's a similar amount of targets that Odell Beckham Jr. was actually getting in Cleveland, yet something drastically different here. I actually saw this popped up to me. I think someone sent me a tweet through Patreon yesterday about the Cooper Kupp double coverage rates. Let me see if I can find that tweet one more time because, I mean, if we're going to be able to find that, I'll definitely be able to give some better insight on this. Okay, now, yeah, there's no way I'm going to find this. Essentially, the tweet was going through and showing the double coverage rate of what you've had with wide receivers so far this season and illustrating that Cooper Kupp sees more double coverage than any other wide receiver in the NFL, at least so far he has in 2021. And, I mean, that makes a lot of sense just based on the wide receiver that Cooper Kupp has been. So now to speak on the difference that Odell Beckham Jr. will have in this Los Angeles Rams scenario versus what he had in Cleveland, it's night and day, and I hate to come out here and just completely change my stance for what we had with Odell Beckham Jr. 2 days ago. But keep in mind, it was a completely different scenario where you're expecting Odell Beckham Jr. to come in and all of a sudden he was going to operate as the field stretching wide receiver in this Los Angeles Rams offense. And you were actually going to have Robert Woods as the flanker. You're going to have Cooper Kupp as the prototypical X. And you thought that Odell Beckham Jr. was going to be replacing Van Jefferson. Van Jefferson was operating as the field stretching wide receiver. Obviously, Van Jefferson, I mean, this wasn't a wide receiver that you loved from a fantasy football context, even though he was getting a ton of snaps in Los Angeles because they kind of needed that player prototype once they let go of Deshaun Jackson. And I really want to give a shout out. I wish I knew your name in the YouTube comment section on that last live stream that we did with Odell Beckham Jr. They came out, they put me in my place. They showed us that 40 time for Van Jefferson. They told us that Van Jefferson was the reason that this team got rid of Deshaun Jackson. You were 100% correct. I was 100% wrong. Nonetheless, now if we're looking at this wide receiver situation and trying to profile how these guys are going to operate in this offense now, the clear 3 wide receiver sets, Cooper Kupp, Odell Beckham Jr., and Van Jefferson. We pulled this up with Van Jefferson. Like I said, we were just 100% wrong in this. You look at what he actually had in that NFL Combine back in 2020. Now, keep in mind, I wasn't necessarily a massive fan of Van Jefferson in that 2020 draft class. This is a wide receiver that did run a 4.39. He ran a 4.39 40-yard dash. So clearly he is going to be operating as that field stretching option that we thought Odell Beckham Jr. would. And now Cooper Kupp's still going to be the prototypical X here based on what we have seen from how other teams are viewing Odell Beckham Jr. And I really want to hammer this point home because I think it's so funny that people in the fantasy football community or just the average NFL fan, they think they know so much more than NFL teams. And they look at that Cleveland Browns organization and they go, oh my God, y'all are so stupid. How do you just go through and move on from Odell Beckham Jr. and get nothing in return a week after the NFL trade deadline? Why couldn't y'all just traded him last week, go and get a second round pick? I promise you, if the Cleveland Browns could have got a second-round pick for Odell Beckham Jr., they would have done so. So now, kind of just going into seeing how opposing teams are viewing Odell Beckham Jr., he's not going to be commanding that much defensive attention. That's going to be going in the direction of Cooper Kupp. And I definitely want to say Cooper Kupp, still the wide receiver 1 in fantasy, 100%. I mean, I actually kind of was a little hesitant in saying that once you had Odell Beckham Jr. signing, knowing that Odell would see more volume than Van Jefferson. We were saying maybe you wanted to go with Devontae Adams instead of Cooper Kupp. At this point, no, 100% Cooper Kupp, still the wide receiver 1 here. And Odell Beckham Jr., you have to get more excited, because if we're going to be looking at the difference between Baker Mayfield and Matthew Stafford, I mean, it is massive. Baker Mayfield in a Cleveland Browns offense that simply is not going to be throwing the ball whatsoever. I mean, you're looking at Baker Mayfield so far this season. This is a quarterback that, I mean, the efficiency numbers are fine. He has 8.6 adjusted yards per pass attempt, yet the issue is they're just not throwing the ball at all. So, of course, you could have fine efficiency at the quarterback position. I mean, if right now you're looking at Baker Mayfield with 225 pass attempts. However, if we're going to go through and we're going to look at Matthew Stafford instead, this is a quarterback that the efficiency is going to be there based on how we know he is extremely talented. And at the same time, you're going to be looking at the fact that they are willing to throw the ball. I mean, even when this team is leading by multiple touchdowns in the second half, they're not the Green Bay Packers. They're not shutting it down and just having a very low pace of play and just kind of running the clock down to then. No, they're still going out there. They're still being aggressive, throwing the ball as frequently as they can. And with Matthew Stafford, you're looking at him, he's had 321 pass attempts so far this season. Compared to what you have with Baker Mayfield at 225, it's just a completely different scenario. Matthew Stafford right now is leading the NFL in passing yards. Now, keep in mind, I mean, he hasn't gone through his bye week, so if you look at a per-game number, Tom Brady's probably at the top there. Nonetheless, we know that Matthew Stafford's going to be that top 3 quarterback, regardless with the passing volume that you're seeing in Los Angeles. This is someone that has the best passer rating in the NFL, the best QBR in the NFL. I mean, his right now, adjusted yards per attempt, like we said, it's going to be a little bit skewed just because you have so much volume there, but 9.2, that's near the very top of the NFL. So we know, I mean, even if you're removing Robert Woods from this offense, I would make the argument, and keep in mind, I want to put this asterisk aside. Y'all know I love Odell Beckham Jr. Literally, the intro of this channel is the Odell Beckham Jr. catch. Nonetheless, we have to stay unbiased. I want to say Robert Woods, probably a more talented wide receiver than Odell Beckham Jr., but Robert Woods being removed from this offense isn't necessarily going to tank the efficiency. They're not going to be picking up that many less first downs. They're not going to have that much fewer trips to the red zone. You're expecting that this is going to make probably the team slightly worse, but not much. The passing volume is still going to be there. Cooper Kupp can't have any more than what he's already had. I mean, you look at Cooper Kupp so far this season, this is a wide receiver that has more 30-point fantasy point weeks than you actually have him with less than 30 points. I mean, this is someone that's had 103 targets so far this year, 103 targets. He's had 74 receptions, over 1,000 receiving yards, and we are halfway through the season. It's not like Cooper Kupp can go any higher. Cooper Kupp's maxed out right here unless you're expecting him to be the best wide receiver of all time. So all of a sudden, I mean, Odell Beckham Jr. is in a range where he's the clear wide receiver 2. Van Jefferson's not going to be seeing as many targets. If Van Jefferson's going to be that field stretching wide receiver, he's the clear wide receiver 2 on one of the best passing offenses in the NFL. It's significantly better than what the situation was 2 days ago. It's a significantly better situation than he had in Cleveland. So now I'm going to go to my rest of season rankings, and let's try to figure out where we are going to have Odell Beckham Jr. And of course, our rest of season rankings are always up to date over there on Patreon. We update those every single week for the Patreon community. Also, go join the Patreon community, get a Fantasy Flock Network hat. I mean, get access to a podcast breaking down your own fantasy team by yours truly once you join. But nonetheless, let's pull up our rest of season rankings, kind of figure out where we need to be putting Odell Beckham Jr. And I would love to know your opinion in the live chat right now. And what's interesting is I actually just get a question in the live chat. It says, is Odell Beckham Jr. going to play on Monday night? I think that actually we probably need to be assuming Odell plays. Now, I am not going to be telling anybody to go through and plan on playing Odell Beckham Jr. in fantasy this week, just because there is the outside chance that he does not suit up. And if that's the case, I think that we just kind of have to play whoever you have on Sunday, because obviously, unless you can get Van Jefferson as the backup situation, then we can pivot over to Jefferson. But, I mean, we had Robert Woods ranked in the same tier in our rest of season rankings as Jalen Waddle, Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith. We had him right ahead of Chase Claypool, Calvin Ridley, Courtland Sutton, Julio Jones, Rashad Bateman, Hunter Renfrow. Odell Beckham Jr. at least jumps up into that range here. So if we're going to be looking at Odell Beckham Jr., like, please let me know in the live chat right now, who would you rather have? rank these players. Just tell me where Odell Beckham Jr. stands, higher or lower. Our tier 7 wide receivers in our rest of season rankings on Patreon. We have Hollywood Brown, Adam Thielen, Brandon Cooks, and T. Higgins. Higher or lower than that group? I'd imagine most people have Hollywood Brown over him. I'll probably still have Hollywood Brown over Odell Beckham Jr., but I think maybe he has to jump over Cooks, Thielen, and T. Higgins just based on the situation that he's going to be in. So, yeah, let's see what the people are saying in the live chat. Let's just kind of talk through this really quick and have some realistic expectations on Odell Beckham Jr. I do want to go through and at least paint the full picture and show how bad Odell has been so far this season. I mean, Odell this year is the wide receiver 83 on a points per game basis. Odell Beckham Jr. is averaging less points per game this year than Bryan Edwards, Nelson Aguilar, Traquan Smith, Russell Gage, Michael Gallup, Randall Cobb, Allen Robinson, T.Y. Hilton, Kadarius Toney, Sammy Watkins, Dante Pettis, Cedric Wilson is averaging more points per game than Odell Beckham Jr. So I want to put at least this into a little bit of context, saying Odell's been horrible. I mean, we're expecting him to get significantly better now that with this situation. Okay. So a lot of people are saying, okay, not over Higgins. No wonder they added Odell Beckham Jr. Low, yes, but it's close, lower. Oh, okay. Honestly, I think I'm right with you. I think you have to have T. Higgins over Odell Beckham Jr. I think that if we're going to be looking at our up-to-date rest of season rankings, Odell's probably going to fall in the range of that Jalen Waddle, Jerry Jeudy range. He's most likely going to be that low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. Now, what's interesting is for me to come out here and call Odell Beckham Jr. a buy or a sell, it's so damn hard to do because, I mean, I want to at least flex a little bit here. Based on the fact that I live stream every single night, my entire life, like you have no idea how my entire life is just fantasy football. We live stream 3 to 4 hours every single night, make videos every single day. I talk to more people across the entire fantasy football community playing in real leagues than anybody else does. And I'm not saying that makes me the best fantasy football player, but I am saying that makes me have a better understanding of the overall fantasy football marketplace than really anybody else does. So I can tell you right now that if you ask me, Mason, what exactly can I get for Odell Beckham Jr. in trade? He will be the hardest player to pin down an exact price point with. So I think it's very important for me to go over to Patreon and make sure we are updating our rest of season rankings to tell you where I have Odell Beckham Jr. But in reality, you could just see a massive gap between prices from league to league. Like if you're going to go through, if you're going to say, oh, should we be buying or selling T. Higgins? I can include T. Higgins in a buy low video 4 weeks ago, because we kind of have a great idea of what his price point is going to be in the majority of leagues. With Odell Beckham Jr., I have no idea how people are going to be valuing him in fantasy. I'm very interested in the live stream tonight because I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of questions about Odell Beckham Jr. A lot of people saying, Mason, do we want Odell Beckham Jr. or wide receiver X? Do we want Odell Beckham Jr. and Hunter Renfrow or running back X? And that way I'll kind of get a feel of what the actual value is for Odell Beckham Jr. in fantasy. And then we can maybe have a stance next week based on if we want to be selling, if we want to be buying. One thing that I will say is we have to be a little realistic here in trying to project out what you're going to see with his value. And that's, he has more upside to increase in trade value than you would have from that tier of Jalen Waddle, Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith. Okay, because if we're realistic here, whether it's right or wrong, but just knowing the fantasy football marketplace, let's say Odell Beckham Jr. comes out in this next week, and let's say they go up against the 49ers Monday night. You know, every single person and their mom is going to be watching that Los Angeles Rams San Francisco 49ers game on Monday night. Say Odell Beckham Jr., he doesn't even have to have a great game. He doesn't have to drop 25 fantasy points. But say Odell goes out there, he has 6 receptions, 60 receiving yards, and comes away with a receiving touchdown. In prime time there, I can tell you right now, everybody is going to be losing their minds with Odell Beckham Jr., and his price point would skyrocket. Like, let's say this week, right? If you're asking me, Mason, who do we prefer in fantasy? I think it's a fair thing to look at that tier break being almost like the T. Higgins, Brandon Cooks, Jalen Waddle, Jerry Jeudy range. Like you're asking me, Mason, who would you rather have, Jerry Jeudy or Odell Beckham Jr.? A big thing that we have to take into account is, let's say this week, Jerry Jeudy and Odell Beckham Jr., they go out there and they have the exact same stat line. They each have 8 receptions, 85 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Who is worth more in fantasy next week? And it's Odell Beckham Jr., and it's not even close, because you know there will be someone in your league that all of a sudden remembers the days. Trust me, I love the glory days. One of my favorite, Odell Beckham Jr. was one of my favorite reasons, and he is one of the impactful players that made me become a diehard dynasty fantasy football player back in 2014, 2015, and just obsessed with that. And that consumed my entire life. And a big reason is that 2014 wide receiver draft class that included Odell Beckham Jr. He's one of like my favorite players of all time, just from a dynasty context. Like, I know there are going to be other people that remember the good old days in 2014, 2015, 2016, like I do. And I know there will be people overreacting to that Monday night game when everybody and their mom is going to be watching that. So I'll say, I probably would prefer that tier wide receiver. Like, I probably would prefer T. Higgins, Brandon Cooks, Adam Thielen, Hollywood Brown, Jalen Waddle. I probably would prefer a lot of those guys over Odell Beckham Jr. But to be completely honest with it, we have to take into account what the fantasy football community is going to do. And if Odell Beckham Jr. has that spike week, maybe then next week we can sell Odell Beckham Jr. You can go out and get Terry McLaurin. I know it sounds crazy to say that right now, but just knowing how people will overreact on a Monday night performance like that, it's a very intriguing thing to at least think about. Overall, Cooper Kupp still the wide receiver one. Now you need to be rostering Van Jefferson. I think you're more excited about Van Jefferson now than you would have been a week ago, just knowing that he will have that same exact role. And I don't think Odell Beckham Jr. is going to be as impactful as Robert Woods. So overall, if I had to tell you if we were going to be buying or selling Odell Beckham Jr., I would still have him as a sell, even though everything about this situation is drastically better. And there is that outside chance that if we do see the spike week, that his value goes to a range where you can sell for a much better return than the other wide receivers I'd be telling you to have him over. Like right now, if we can move Odell Beckham Jr. and you get Hollywood Brown in return, that would be unbelievable. I would love making that trade, no hesitation. But at the same time, it's really hard for me to come out here and tell you to just sell Odell Beckham Jr. no matter what, because in reality, his price is going to be wildly different from league to league. If you're an Odell Beckham Jr. owner, I think you at least have to send out a message in your group chat, say Odell Beckham Jr. is on the block, and see what your offers would be, because maybe I'm underestimating how excited people are going to get about Odell here. And now, of course, thank you so much for everybody who came out to the live stream. If you did not drop a like on this live stream, fix your life. Please go down there, drop that like on the stream. Very sick getting this out for y'all. And we're honestly going to have 3 more live streams today on this channel. We're going to have the $1,000 bankroll challenge. And we're also going to have the last minute injury updates for every single player in fantasy football that we're going to be doing later today. So I can tell you exactly who's going to be playing and then the options that we're going to be pivoting to if you have a player missing. And we're also going to answer every single question we can in the live stream tonight in our typical Q&A answer, whatever you want to call it. We have live streamed every single day for over 100 days in a row. Make sure you please go down there and drop that like in the stream, subscribe to the channel. And yeah, that's all I got for you. Thank you so much and have a great day.